Welcome to PRI's Next Round podcast. The new California budget is out, and so we brought together our PRI team to discuss various aspects of the governor's budget, proposed new budget. We start out with Wayne Winegarden, Senior Fellow in Business and Economics and Director of PRI Center for Medical Economics and Innovation. Then Lance Izumi, Senior Director in Education on Education Spending, Senior Fellow Steve Smith on Crime, and Kerry Jackson, the William Clement Fellow on California Reform. But first, we got to begin with the fires. So I'm here in Pasadena, a few miles from the Eaton fire. Downtown Pasadena was pretty much a ghost town for several days. The winds toppled down a lot of trees, a lot of palm fronds, tree branches. There was dust, leaves. Then, of course, the ash rained in on us. The hotels were full of evacuees, practically an evacuation camp center here. Right now, it's been a few days out. We're advised not to drink the water. And frankly, I hate masks, but over the first few days, I walked to work in a mask. And unfortunately, several of PRI's friends and supporters lost their homes or were evacuated. And it's a heartbreaking issue. Sadly, Tim, our elected officials didn't exactly rise to the occasion.
No, I mean, when, you have people literally fleeing for their lives, they have to leave their cars on the side of the road. You see just thousands of acres, thousands of structures destroyed or damaged. And really, you ask yourself that question, where do we even begin to rebuild? What do we do? Where do you go? It's different from an earthquake or other natural disaster, right? I mean, you've literally lost everything, in a matter of hours. And then you see the mayor of Los Angeles just kind of stand there and stare with an expressionless face when asked by a reporter, gee, do you have anything to say to the people affected by the fires? I mean, this is not rocket science here. Then you see Victor Davis Hanson put it best. He said, Gavin Newsom was flying in to do these sort of performance art stunts, right? And you see him with his little hat and his little jacket. And, everything, conceivably that he's doing right is more about politics and preserving his nascent presidential campaign and deflecting the buck. And we're going to, when he finally got on the phone with Joe Biden, he talked about, we've got to combat this misinformation against me. Well, no, we need to actually fight the fires and demand answers of why things were the way they were, and the infrastructure failures and the wildfire, the obviously borderline criminal lack of wildfire prep. And we've got to get things going and quickly to rebuild, and you see people wondering, well, why is he spending time going on Pod Save America with the Obama bros on a day when the wildfires are expanding in Tarzana? To me, it's kind of a microcosm of all the things I write about in the California Left Coast Survivors Guide. It's some of it's policy, but a lot of it is attitude, right? That it's, well, you lived really what I would say is a freedom-filled life, right? You had a home with a big yard and you drove an SUV and you used gas appliances and your kids go to good schools. And oh, by the way, we demand algebra be taught at those schools. And, you're not living in a 1,000-square-foot dense condo downtown. You're not growing beans out back and riding your bike to work. And, your kid didn't give up their spot at UCLA in the name of equity. And I think there's an aspect of, well, these people kind of get what they deserve. Now, Gavin, and to a lesser degree Bass, you can't discount the charge that he's only acting because these are the bluest precincts of Los Angeles. These are his wealthiest supporters who are affected here. And yes, he is taking action to waive CEQA and waive Coastal Commission permit requirements because these are his supporters. These are his donors. Well, why aren't the areas of the Camp Fire and other parts of the state in Northern and Central California that have, faced equally severe damage, why didn't they get the same kind of waivers and cutting through the red tape when they went through their fires? And then what Sacramento's response? We're having a special session to fight Donald Trump. Now, they finally got the message this morning. Breaking news, they've delayed now the special session. But, I think there's a real sense that government at all levels failed the people of Southern California. There are real questions of confidence from elected officials and bureaucrats. And then, you have people that are elected leaders that seem to be more concerned about their political standing rather than helping people. And so I think there's a real challenge that they're going to have, both rebuilding and restoring the community's trust.
Well, certainly we hope that this will finally drive down, unfortunately, the long-term policy failures that we've suffered through in California. As you say, the lack of water. We hear that fire hydrants didn't have enough water at 3 a.m. What's that about? The fact that we do very little forestry, clearing. So many of these issues that we've been writing about for a decade or so have all come to, this culminated in this disaster that you can't help Mother Nature. There's going to be Santa Ana winds in California. But I certainly believe that you could have mitigated this catastrophe.
Well, all the points Newsom ticks off as far as we spent this much, we did that, we did this. Well, what are the outcomes? Number one, obviously we had no outcomes because we had this destructive fire. But then number two, okay, we spent all this money. Well, what did you spend it on? Yes, we've allocated all this money to water infrastructure, but did that go to repair or replace the Santa Ynez Reservoir? Obviously not. Did it go to repair and upgrade the fire hydrants and the system pumping water to the fire hydrants? Obviously not. So it goes back to the question of, well, A, what are we spending the money on? But B, outcomes and competence. Are our leaders seeing these challenges? Are they stepping up to the occasion? But are they getting the job done? And obviously on outcomes, you can tick off all this money we're spending, but obviously we're not spending it where it needs to be spent.
That's right, Tim. And that leads to our discussion with Wayne Winegarden, a senior fellow in business and economics at PRI. And we're going to talk with him about the new budget.
Yeah, we're going to talk with Wayne to get an overview of the governor's budget plan, and then we'll follow up in talking with Lance and Steve and Kerry about the other aspects of the budget that they're following. So if you're interested in state spending and the state budget, this is the episode for you. We'll get back to Next Round in just a moment, but first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week.
Wayne, let's start our discussion of the state budget with a 30,000-foot view question. The governor framed his roughly $322 billion state budget as promoting, quote, an efficient and leaner government. He channeled the spirit of Elon Musk's DOGE effort by saying that in the state of California, DOGE is spelled ODI, promoting his administration's budget efficiency efforts. Yet you argue that his spending plan is neither efficient nor lean. So how so? And what are some of the biggest flaws of the Newsom spending plan as you see them? And how do you evaluate the administration's efficiency efforts?
Well, I think the efficiency efforts, they fall short. Their efficiency on paper only. There are some good things in that he's getting rid of vacant positions that's it's unfilled. They're getting rid of those headcounts. Undoubtedly, that's a good thing and that's useful. But the problem is that the budget is an increase in spending of 8%, and it's very confusing. The budget, there's if you did a flow chart of our budget, I mean, it'd be an impenetrable mess with all the expenditures and earmarks and all of those things. And I think in some ways the governor is kind of leveraging that complexity to say things that are patently not correct. So again, the bottom line, the current year we were spending $297 billion, about 298. He wants to spend $322 billion. That's an 8% increase. It's an 8% increase when we have 3% inflation. That's not lean, right? When you're growing 5 percentage points above inflation, you're not having a lean budget. And in terms of efficiency, he focuses on kind of almost like a government-centric position, but he's not really looking at the outcomes that people care about. Public services, the quality of public services. Is the crime improving in this state? When you look at that measures, the answer is no. And the things he's doing isn't going to change that. So when he's talking about efficiency, it's not efficiency from the perspective that residents of California care about or residents of California are going to see, which is a government that provides better services at less cost.
So reform was another buzzword in the governor's press conference and the director of finance's unveiling of the budget. And Newsom spoke at length, of course, about his administration's reforms that he says are making a difference in tackling homelessness and crime. But, on the subject of crime, you've argued that the governor's talk of reform is just that, it's talk. So share with our listeners some of the specific examples of how the governor's talk of successful reform in these areas are really just budget rhetoric rather than an actual accomplishment.
Right. I mean, the budget rhetoric, because we have years of evidence showing that the policy approach is failing. Right? Whether it's crime, whether it's homelessness, the kind of the guiding principles that are, the spending is supposed to fulfill, that guiding principle isn't working. Right. Take homelessness, which is something that we've examined so often. California has that housing first approach. That housing first approach, which is that we're going to build everybody a permanent home. That's how we're going to address homelessness. We're going to build everyone a permanent home. And these homes cost $700,000 because of all of the regulations, that are involved. So it's just way too expensive to actually kind of efficiently fulfill that mandate and actually address the homelessness problem. And also, it doesn't get at the root causes of the problem. When we talk about homelessness, whether it's what initially caused the problem or not, most people who are homeless are struggling with mental addiction, with mental illness, or struggling with addiction. And so unless you deal with those problems, you're not going to sustainably address homelessness. Housing First doesn't do that. And what we keep doing is keep throwing more and more money at the programs that aren't working. And that's why we spent over $20 billion since 2019 on homelessness, and the numbers of homeless keep going up. It's the same thing with crime. The governor opposed Prop 36. They did, pass some reforms that kind of went in the right direction, but it's not far enough. In Prop 36, what we're trying to do is actually enforce the laws. Stealing is stealing. That's illegal. You need to be punished for it. And this kind of lacks on crime. It's created these incentives that is, why wouldn't you, if you're in that position, you're going to take advantage of the situation. And we see that over and over again. So the problem, again, whether it's homelessness, whether it's crime, or the myriad of other issues, is that you're working the kind of the wrong fundamentals. And when you're working those wrong fundamentals, no matter how much money you throw at it, you're just not going to get to the solution. You just don't have a sustainable answer.
As our listeners may remember from last year's budget debate, much of the public back and forth was the governor challenging the nonpartisan legislative analyst's office on the size and the scope of the deficit. So this year, the governor projects the state is running a small surplus, nothing to write home about. How do you view the governor's fiscal projections for the state? And do you think he understands the gravity of our revenue and spending picture? Or do you think the budget is about right in terms of the forecast and projections it's built on?
I don't think the forecasts are correct. I think there's some unwarranted optimism that's built in, and there's a few anomalies that are built into the revenue assumptions that just make you kind of question what the fundamentals behind the budget. An example, they're projecting personal income tax revenues are going to go 10%, but corporate income tax revenues are going to decline 12%. It's a huge discrepancy in measures that you would think that they would be interrelated, right? If personal income taxes are going up because there's prosperity, then why aren't corporate income taxes going up? So there's those types of issues kind of raise questions of what assumptions are you using, and are you kind of working some kind of overly optimistic assumptions about the stock market in order to get the revenues you want for the budget. So that's one kind of concern. Another concern is that it doesn't seem to have any kind of room to address kind of the new administration. I mean, one kind of big question mark hanging over our budget is what type of clawbacks are going to come from the new Trump administration. The train to nowhere, right? The high-speed rail, and that's a perfect example. Will we continue to receive the same amount of funding from the DC? And if we don't, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to continue to spend our money, or are we going to try to replace that? None of that is addressed, and obviously that's difficult to address, but that does raise a lot of questions about the validity of the assumptions that are put in there. And on the expenditure side, one of the concerns is that they haven't fully thought through, kind of prioritize which programs make sense. With the wildfires and all the damage that's coming through there, and obviously this is a new issue, but we have so much waste that's within the budget, so many symbolic programs that are costly that aren't achieving kind of what they're supposed to achieve. And so this creates kind of some concerns as well that, again, budget doesn't address. And a last concern, which is raised by the Legislative Analyst's Office, is the out year. Budget, the governor keeps patting himself on the back about having a 2-year budget and thinking ahead, which they did in the last budget, but they're not looking ahead anymore. And when you look at the spending trends of what's been happening, you look at the revenue trends of what's been happening, what the LAO rightly concludes is that, in the following year, we're going to have a $20 billion deficit, and that's going to grow to $30 billion because our spending is growing much faster than our revenues. Well, there's absolutely no acknowledgement of these long-term trends in this budget. And so I guess we've stopped looking ahead, like the governor has been bragging about, but that, again, looking at kind of are his projections reasonable? Does this budget kind of meet the moment? And all of these factors kind of raise concerns that it just simply doesn't.
Wayne, following up on that a little bit, a lot of the chatter was about the governor declaring a surplus, but yet we're still taking money out of the rainy day fund. So how do those two things square?
Well, I mean, the rainy day funds, right? That was part of last year's kind of budget. So we're continuing to just fulfill kind of what was agreed upon last year. It just needs to be enacted this year. I do think that's an acknowledgement that the amount of revenues that are being generated are just not sufficient to be covering the amount of expenditures that the government wants to spend. Not that we should be increasing revenues. What we need to be doing is bringing our expenditures back in line with what we as taxpayers can afford. But again, what this is showing is this notion of putting on kind of the economy this amount of spending that is just excessive, that is too much, and it's beginning to, in effect, undermine the private sector economy, from which, without a healthy economy, you don't get the revenues to give you the government services that we need. So I think the fact that we're using those rainy day funds, yes, it was in the plan, and that certainly is kind of just a continuation of that, but it just raises questions about the appropriateness of our expenditure levels. And I would argue what it's saying is that what we actually need is not just a rhetorical kind of lean budget, but an actual lean budget that reduces spending, controls spending, and starts getting rid of these programs that they cost us a lot of money, that are symbolic, but just aren't achieving anything close to what its proponents claim.
So the governor previewed his budget plan on Monday before the horrific Southern California wildfires broke out. So naturally, the state is going to be on the hook for billions of unexpected new spending to address the wildfire recovery and response. So how will this complicate the governor's budget balancing efforts this year? And can we count on Washington to send us a big check that will cover a lot of this spending with his number one adversary, Donald Trump, becoming president in just a few days? Or does the governor now have an unexpected new multi-billion-dollar budget shortfall to deal with?
Well, the governor has a multi-billion-dollar shortfall to deal with. I mean, the wildfire, it's going to have direct and indirect impacts that are going to be problematic. As for the federal money, if we start with that question, that's one of the big unknowns. I mean, it's hard to guess exactly what President Trump would do. You would imagine that the emergency funds that might be more likely to go through, but are there going to be strings attached? And if there are strings attached, how will the governor respond to those? I mean, I think those are some of the concerns from a federal revenue perspective. I think some of the other spending, I think we mentioned earlier, like the bullet train, those types of funds, I think those are definitely in jeopardy and something that you have to be concerned that will the governor may try to backfill those expenditures and that would be a budget busting kind of change if that were to happen. So you definitely have all of those questions, but we also now have the state insurer, and it certainly doesn't seem to have the resources to cover all of the claims that are going to be coming from the fire. How does that get handled? What type of budget impact does that have? And that's a huge unknown that's hanging over the budget, but that has the potential to blow things up. There's also going to be an economic consequence. Right? I mean, we've just decimated, or I should say the fires have just decimated a huge kind of infrastructure, and so that's going to have an impact. What will the houses and the commercial real estate and all the things that have been lost, will they be rebuilt? When do people come back in? How is that going to impact income tax revenues in the short run? I mean, there's all sorts of unknowns once we get past the immediate tragedy of the fires burning that are going to have implications for the budget. And at this point, it's just too difficult to know exactly what those impacts are going to be. But I think it does require a tremendous amount of expenditure control on all other parts of the budget, because there's this huge unknown that we need to deal with that we're not. And going back to that long-term fiscal issue we were just talking about, I think it also demonstrates why it's so important that we have a sustainable budget in the long term that recognizes that horrible things happen, and you have to have a budget that has enough flexibility worked into it that you can respond to these issues. And that's clearly when you're spending every dime you possibly can every year, you don't have that type of budget. So I think that's an important issue to go forward.
So the governor likes to brag about how much better and more successful California is on a host of quality of life and economic letters, and he likes to compare to states like Texas and Florida. And one of these boasts that caught your attention is his boast that the tax burden that Californians pay is on average compared to the rest of the country. And he also explained that the budget roller coaster that we're on is just a normal function of budgeting in California. So since the media didn't really fact check him, here's your turn. Why is the governor wrong here? Is our boom-bust budget cycles really just an inevitable component of California budgeting? And why does California's tax burdens hurt California and complicate the state budget?
Yeah, well, first, like you said, he is patently wrong, right? California does not have an average tax burden. If you just look at tax collections and relative to income, and you compare California to the rest of the country, where just state revenues alone were about 20% higher as a burden, right? Taxes relative to income in California. So undoubtedly, no, we're not an average tax burden state. Wallet Hub, right? They rank us as the 5th highest. I mean, survey after survey will tell you that California's tax burden is much higher than the average state. We have the highest state sales tax rate, highest top marginal personal income tax rate. Our corporate income tax rate is high. So this assertion that he keeps making is wrong. I don't know if he's just unaware or if he's being deceptive or just outright lying. But the bottom line is that no, California is a high tax, high spend state with a very progressive, burdensome tax system. And it's because we have such a burdensome tax system that's such a progressive tax system that we exacerbate the revenue volatility cycle. I mean, all states have kind of a fiscal cycle. When the economy does better, tax revenues are higher. When the economy does worse, tax revenues are lower. That's a constant across all states, 100% correct. But what's not correct is that the extent of the volatility that we experience here in California is normal. We have excessive volatility that most other states don't have. I say most other states because other high tax states that are wealthy, like New York, have the same problem. Because when incomes go up and the stock market performs well, you have the very kind of entrepreneurial kind of classes that are doing very well, and that progressive tax system just captures a big part of that wealth. But the flip side of that is when the economy is doing poorly and the entrepreneurial class is not doing well. In fact, some of them are recording losses. The tax revenues crash because they have, their incomes are negative or they have no income. So that is the kind of the root cause of our volatile tax system. It's excessively volatile. It's because of this progressivity that we have built into the system. And if you want to tamp down that volatility, which should be a goal because it makes it much more stable from a budgeting perspective, it actually tamps down kind of some of this volatility, which discourages growth and has other types of implications as well. You've got to address that progressivity. You have to get a tax system that is broader based with lower rates. And that's a way to kind of encourage more growth. And through that encouraging more growth, you're going to encourage prosperity, for all Californians. That's what we should be doing. We're not. But to say that, this progressivity is just something inherent that we must endure, that's just 100% false.
Thanks so much, Wayne.
Well, thank you.
We'll get back to our great guest in just a moment. But first, are you following PRI on Facebook? By following PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, that's all one word, you'll be the first to read free market ideas from PRI's terrific team of scholars on all the hot issues like education freedom, single-payer healthcare, crime, homelessness, green mandates like the ban on natural gas appliances, and more. Plus, when you follow PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, you'll be the first to know when tickets go on sale for PRI's must-attend luncheons, dinners, and galas across the state. And you'll be first in line to secure your spot to hear great speakers like Michael Schellenberger, Gordon Chang, Steve Hilton, and many more. So go to facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute and follow PRI today so you'll be the first to know.
So now let's turn to Lance Izumi, Senior Director of Education Studies. Lance, like every governor, Governor Newsom touted that the state was making a record investment in education spending and would be dedicating a record amount of per-pupil government spending on education. He spoke a lot about the billions he has spent for, quote, universal TK and the, quote, equity multiplier. How do you evaluate the governor's education spending priorities? Is what Newsom proposing going to do anything to turn around a state that has among the nation's worst math and reading scores?
Well, that's an important question, Ro. It's important to understand just how much education spending has grown under Governor Newsom. If you compare the amount of money that California has spent on education since 2019, which was Newsom's first enacted budget, and how much he's spending now, it's been a huge increase. So, for example, if you look back at his 2019-20 budget, California spent $103 billion $103 billion in state, local, and federal funds together for education. And now that translates to more than $17,000 per pupil, which, all very goodly amounts. But, you come to this year's proposed budget that Governor Newsom is pushing out there, total education spending comes to whopping, it's huge, $137 billion, which pencils out to nearly $25,000 per pupil. So significant increases from 2019-20 in his first budget. But the question really is not so much even how much he's spending, the increase has been huge, but how we evaluate all this spending, because the bottom line has to be whether California taxpayers have been getting real bang for their buck. And in other words, has this increase in funding resulted in a similar increase in student achievement? And the answer is no, considering the fact that in the latest state test score data available, you've got 70% of eighth graders who don't meet grade level math standards. And also a majority of eighth graders fail to meet grade level reading standards. So the question then is, why are student outcomes so poor when so much money is being spent on education? And the reason is that much of this money is being spent on programs that have not and will not raise student achievement. Now, I'll give you just one example. The governor's funding 2,000 schools that will be using the so-called community schools model that is supposed to bring together educational, health, and mental health services into schools. The trouble is that there's really little evidence to show that community schools, this model, improves student performance at all. There's been studies by Harvard and other entities that have shown that community schools actually provide little academic bang for the buck. And yet, what does all this money go for? Well, actually, what this money does is it really empowers the teachers' unions and other leftist groups to give them greater power to institute critical race theory and other highly ideological practices in schools. And if you look at various school districts around California that have been using the community schools model, this is already happening. And so, my friend Bill Evers, he's a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Education. I think he's right when he says that we cannot allow community schools to serve as a Trojan horse for indoctrination, especially when academic achievement in California is so low. And I think that this community school funding is very, emblematic of the type of spending that we're doing here in California. Money that is going more towards ideological promotion than to improving student academic achievement.
So one subject area that you've written a lot about in recent months is the state's poor efforts at reading and math education. And in his budget press conference, the governor championed that the state is now screening for those with reading difficulties. But as you've made the case, California just isn't doing what it should be doing to improve reading and math instruction, which is both a policy issue, but it's also a fiscal issue. So what should our budget priorities be when it comes to preparing our kids for the future, especially when it comes to reading and math? And what can Newsom's team learn from Republicans and Democrats in other states?
Well, that's an excellent question, Tim. Well, let's talk about reading. So the latest state test results show that a large majority of third and fourth graders, so our youngest children who are tested, third and fourth graders, are not reading at grade level. But we know that the best way to teach kids to read proficiently is through the use of the science of reading. Now, this is an instructional method that includes phonemic awareness, phonics, which many people understand is sounding out words, vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension. So these are the pillars of the science of reading, which evidence hundreds of studies show that this is the most effective way to teach kids how to read. Yet in my latest book, The Great Classroom Collapse, I interviewed a California dad who said that his school district in the Los Angeles area was using a totally ineffective reading instructional method that emphasized guessing at words. And unfortunately, this type of reading instructional method is very prevalent throughout California, not just in that one district. And so, there's a real problem with how we're teaching kids to read in California. Now, the governor proposes $40 million to screen students for reading difficulties. Now, that's great. Yet, even if we know a child has a reading problem through, let's say, the screening process, now those problems are not going to be solved if California school districts continue to use ineffective, unscientific reading instructional methods. If you think about it this way, you can have a good diagnosis, but bad medicine does not cure the ailment. So the governor's budget, he actually, it's interesting. You read through his budget summary on the education side, and he does make some nods at least rhetorically, to the science of reading, but he doesn't come close to doing what, for example, Governor Kathy Hochul, who's a fellow Democrat, did in her new budget in New York. In Hochul's budget, she allocated money specifically to train 20,000 teachers in New York in the science of reading. And also school districts in New York will now have to align their instructional practices with the science of reading. So Hochul's gotten the heads of the New York university systems to commit to changing the instruction in their institutions to support the science of reading. So it's a very, whole educational system approach to improving reading for kids by instituting the science of reading throughout New York. So now you look at that, what they did in New York, and you contrast that to here in California, where last year there was a bill by Assembly Member Blanca Rubio, who I interviewed for my book, The Great Classroom Collapse, that would have done a lot of what Governor Hochul in New York has done. But the California Teachers Association killed the bill in the legislature, and Governor Newsom really did little to help it pass. So if we're going to improve reading in the state, we've got to change the way reading is taught in California classrooms. And for our children, it really is imperative.
Thanks so much, Lance.
Thank you very much.
We'll get back to our terrific interview in just a moment, but first, PRI's YouTube channel is must watch. By visiting youtube.com/Pacific Research 1, that's the number 1, you can watch webinars, videos, and other original content, including our new Free City Center video tours and interviews. You can watch as PRI's Wayne Winegarden tours Dignity Moves, a San Francisco nonprofit that is reimagining scalable solutions to homelessness with founder and CEO Elizabeth Funk. And you can check out Stephen Greenhut's tour of a proposed new city in rural Solano County that has generated significant interest and intrigue. You can even listen to previous episodes of Next Round Podcast. So visit PRI's YouTube channel today at youtube.com/Pacific Research 1, that's the number 1, and click the subscribe button to receive notifications about our latest content as soon as it's posted.
Steve, Governor Newsom spent a great deal of time in his budget press conference discussing his administration's efforts to, quote, keeping California safe. Yet it seems that he hasn't moved on from the massive rejection voters gave him on Prop 36 related to retail theft, which he actually calls the proposition that shall not be named. How do you evaluate the governor's public safety budget priorities overall, and more specifically as it relates to combating retail theft?
Yeah, I think when you're going to talk about his efforts, to address retail theft, you need to talk about the scope of the retail sector, which in California is massive. There are 164,000 retailers generating $571 billion in earnings that employs 2.8 million people. That's a fifth of California's workforce. And included in that are 11,000 grocery and convenience stores. And, it trickles on down from there. What we saw after Prop 47, of course, was the emergence of these opportunist criminals who quickly assessed that a misdemeanor in California, especially with the progressive judges that we have in place, is really no deterrent at all. And we saw an explosion in retail theft that got so big that it just couldn't be ignored anymore. So to address what the governor proposed was $370 million to specifically target retail theft in a sector of that size is, I think, weak at best. That $370 million, is going to be dispersed over a state with 38 billion people in it, with over 500 law enforcement agencies who are challenged by hundreds of thousands of thefts that are occurring, both officially reported and, of course, the bulk of which are not officially reported because there is no incentive until Prop 36 was passed for retailers or any theft victim, for that matter, to even pick up the phone. This trickles down to the court system as well, which is backlogged, and these misdemeanor thieves, would wait. Well, the current statistics are this: 50% of misdemeanor arrests are not resolved after 120 days in the court system. So warrants are issued and ignored. Police officers are not out there making proactive car stops. They're not going after warrant arrests because they're bogged down in 911 calls for more serious crimes. If the governor thinks that $370 million is going to provide an effective deterrent, I think he's wrong.
Let's talk about an issue that you've written about on our Right by the Bay blog, and that the state's efforts for services for victims of crime. Newsom touted this $308 million in his little press conference that he says the state's invested since 2022 on crime victim services. But you give Newsom and his team a failing grade in this area, and you've actually argued that this amount is just a drop in the bucket for victims. So talk about this issue, and also how would you advise the governor when it comes to funding for improving crime victim services, especially, in light of our wildfires, where you may have some of these people are victims of arson crime?
Well, absolutely. In 2023, the Victim of Crime Board issued checks totaling $37,780 to California's arson victims, which is just absurd given that the losses in 2023 were $185,925,000 and totaled 6,736 victims. So to say that the Victims Crime Board is going to help arson victims with, less than $40,000 is just borders on the absurd. Arson is certainly one of the most underfunded areas by the Victims Crime Board, but given that California has about 1 million crime victims every year, they share in a pot of last year $47,366,000. The Crime Board administrative budget is greater than that, meaning the Crime Board is spending more on itself than it is actually spending on victims. California's 135,000 assault victims share just $14 million. 280,000 DUI injury victims got 1.6 million. California's 1,800 homicide victims got 17.5 million, which is one of the largest outlays. Well, that was just for funereal costs. The survivors of those victims, their families and loved ones, got next to nothing. Rape victims, again, one of the most egregious areas, there were 13,723, shared just $1.9 million. Crime scene cleanups, which was one of the areas of increase, received just $38,000. Medical and dental expenses, just 6.4. Mental health outlays, 9.4. Given that a clinical psychologist bills at over $200 an hour, you can see that goes almost nowhere. In fact, one of the largest areas of victim outlays were exonerated felons. And while I think that exonerated felons are deserving of significant compensation, I'm not sure that the Victims Crime Board is the place where that should be housed. 12 exonerated felons in 2023 received $10.3 million, or pretty close to $900,000 each. That tells me that the Victims Crime Board is really just kind of political theater to address a really serious problem. People are the victims of violent crimes, people who are the victims of sexual assaults, families of homicide victims, are amongst the most, potentially, psychologically damaged and certainly financially damaged people in California. And to say that, $47 million in 2023 was generous would just, it would stretch the limits of credulity, at least on my part. And I think California's crime victims are dramatically underserved by this budget.
So Steve, overall, what do you think of this budget?
Well, I think it's, I think it pales in comparison to the scope of the problem. If 1,800 homicide victims and 10,000 drug overdose victims is an acceptable level of death in California, then it's just fine, because that's going to continue. We're, to earmark $80 million for drug task force, spending, in light of the scope of that level of death, I think is just, I think it's horrible. I think it's condemning, thousands of people to death. I think that the Band-Aid of, having, Narcan, millions of Narcan doses, dispersed around the state is only a Band-Aid of the problem. I think there have been 300,000, according to the state websites, administrations of Narcan. The problem is those people are just left on the streets to go back to, to their next overdose, right? So it's a cycle of death that, yes, could, shows a momentary drop. The death rate dropped from 10,000 in 2022 to about 8,000 in 2023. And they say, we haven't seen official statistics, but they say that they've dropped even more in 2024. I think that drop is really due to the Narcan administrations. And that's just a temporary drop as those people, continue on their suicidal path.
Yeah, Steve, I think this is beyond everyone's sense of decency. And thank you so much for making it clear to everyone what's really happening.
It's my pleasure, Ro.
So let's turn to Kerry Jackson, our William Clement Fellow in California Reform, for some of the transportation issues that the governor has in his budget. Kerry, with our discussion of the governor's budget rollout, the other major priority he focused on, which was high-speed rail. After his press conference at Stanislaus State in Turlock, he went down to the Bakersfield area for a press conference touting high-speed rail and his administration's continued championing of funding for the project. How would the Newsom budget continue throwing money at the train to nowhere? And from what Newsom announced, is there any real confidence that this project, or even the first leg of it, will be completed anytime soon and receive sufficient outside resources to pay for it?
Well, the governor sure looked publicly confident, and we saw that in the news conference he had at Bakersfield last week. But privately, if he's confident privately, then I'm going to use a strong word here. I'm going to say he's delusional. There's nothing in the history of this project that suggests any part of it will be finished anytime soon. And he was talking about that. He even mentioned train sets. Are we looking at train sets spring? He said, I don't want to say soon, but it's coming. It's coming. We're not too far away. Again, if he's thinking, that's okay, I suppose, for him to say this publicly because he's putting up the front. But if he's privately thinking that this is, finally going to get this project going, then his thinking isn't too strong. And it's just taken 16 years from the time the voters approved Prop 1A before they even drove the first ceremonial spikes. That was last week. That was one of the visuals they had at the news conference. The high-speed rail is $100 billion over budget, a couple of decades behind. They've already sunk $11 billion into it, when that's $2 billion more than the bond that the voters approved, $9 billion bond in 2008. And now the governor in his coming budget he's proposing another $4 billion. And he says, he talked about getting money from Washington. He's going to pull as much money from there as he can. But of course, that's going to change with Trump in the White House starting a week from today. So that spigot is probably going to dry up.
So, with Amtrak Joe leaving the White House, it's clear that Congress isn't going to be appropriating money for California's high-speed rail system anytime soon. And in fact, when you look at Elon Musk's Doge effort, and when you look at a bill by Congressman Kevin Kiley from the Sacramento area, they're actually going to do the opposite. They're going to try and sweep away the unspent high-speed rail money or prohibit future funding for it. So if California stands to lose what, modest money we do have now from Washington for the project, how does Newsom propose to keep it funded? And, is it realistic to expect that state taxpayers can pick up the check for, what may amount to be the entire project construction?
Well, I'll take that last one first and say that, it's not realistic to expect California taxpayers to fund the entire project or the rest of it, whatever the rest of it is. But, and this is hard. This is going to sound hard, but in a sense, that would be fair. It was California voters who approved it, 53-47 roughly. So they shouldn't expect to be bailed out by the rest of the taxpayers in the 49 other states. I mean, what about a potato farmer in Idaho who's never going to use it? Why would his tax money go to that on what's clearly become a boondoggle? Why would a lobster fisherman in Maine, same thing? He's never going to use the high-speed rail in California. Why should his taxes go to something like that? I don't imagine he or anyone else has a plan on paper or even in their head to pay for the train if they don't get any federal aid. What would that cost? I mean, think about it. Finishing the project will take at least roughly a third at $100 billion, a third of what Sacramento spends in a year. And we were just talking about the budget, and now what he proposes $322 billion or so. So $100 billion of that is almost a third. Of course, that's not going to all come at one time out of one budget. But if let's say you get $4 billion a year on the budget for the train, and that's all you're going to get, it's going to take a quarter of a century to finish the thing, at least. And at that point, it's going to be, 30 years behind schedule? So I don't see, if he has a plan, I'd like to see it.
Thanks so much, Kerry, and thanks to everyone else for participating. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.